Deuteronomy 30 is, of course, some final comments on the covenant being made between Israel and the Lord at Sinai. And in terms of the I and the you, the I there is probably the Lord himself giving a commandment to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the you, strictly speaking, Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, is focused on the proper need for obedience among the people of God. Right? There's no phase in redemptive history where the requirement of obedience is abrogated.
Right.
Right. It's always present.
Yes.
So the question of Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 to 14, then, is how on earth is that possible to begin with? And the way that Jeremiah begins to interpret it for us is the way of obedience for you is by means of the obedient work of the Lord himself, especially as it will come to fulfillment in the person and work of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have some actual pretty good dialogue here in terms of the way the gospel works in relationship to obedience, on how Christ is the one who will perfectly obey. And then it's in spirit right union with him that the people are then circumcised in their hearts, so that they might also be able to be obedient to the Lord and actually offer up to him good works.
Yeah, that might lend some light onto Romans 1:5 and the traditional difficulty of what understanding what is the obedience of faith. I'll just throw that out there as a something to think about. I'm not going to comment. Let's talk about go ahead and continue, but I'm curious then to speak also about some of these other specific themes that we have regarding Israel, and even previous to Israel, we have Babel, and then you have the Exodus, because all of this is involved too with the specific language that's used. That helps us to understand what is entailed and who will do what and how.
So in terms of how this progresses in this narrative, that gospel interplay of the Lord himself being the one who obeyed the covenant and then renew us to be able to do it, I think plays out in verses 12 and 13. So in verse 11, we have two negative clauses presented here. It's not too wonderful for you, and it's not too far off. And then what I think happens is verse 12 and verse 13 then interpret those two clauses for us respectively. So verse 12 is an interpretation of it's not too wonderful for you. And then verse 13 is an interpretation of it's not too far off. And so the interpretation of it's not too hard for you is it's not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend to heaven for us to bring it to us that we may hear and that we may do it. Now, again, on a surface read, it sounds like, it's just, it's here, it's by us, I have my Bible beside me here, therefore I can go and do it. But I think this actually reveals to us not so much that we have a text near to us, but the way that the Lord is covenantally near to us in history. And I do this by juxtaposing this text with the Babel narrative in Genesis chapter 11. And the Babel narrative in Genesis chapter 11 is essentially an attempt for sinful man to ascend into heaven, to reverse the curse of the fall. So in Genesis chapter 11, we're actually backtracking a little bit into chapter 10. We've had the flood narrative. Mankind is seen in sort of this new world order after the flood, the now world, right? Like Peter talks about. And then we have all of these nations come together, and the end of Genesis chapter 10 is that they are scattered across the face of the earth. This is actually very similar to the fall in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 4, where man is cast out of the garden and scattered across the face of the earth. And then in Genesis chapter 11, we have mankind coming back together again and seeking to construct a city. This whole narrative is actually a recap of Genesis 4, where Cain does what? He seeks to gather people together and construct a city. And they even happen in the same place, right? Cain's city is constructed in the east, and the Tower of Babel, or the city of Babel, is constructed where? And on the plain of Shinar in the east, right? So they're probably even happening in the same geographical sphere. So we have in both of these texts a reference to an exilic fall or an endemic exile, where in the fall man is cast out of the presence of God and scattered across the face of the earth. This then is what provides the lens for what the people at Babel try to do in Genesis chapter 11. Because in Genesis chapter 11, these people gather together, and what they try to do is, verse 4 is this. They try to make a name for themselves and to present themselves from being dispersed over the face of the earth. So what they're doing in constructing this tower in this city is attempting to reverse the fall of the exile, to reverse the exilic dispersion of man across the earth. Now, I think this is especially in an attempt to ascend into the heavenly realm by means of what they are constructing. Because what they're constructing in Genesis chapter 11 isn't just, a fancy castle tower or something like that. It would have been a ziggurat in the ancient Near East. A ziggurat was a kind of a staircase-like temple structure meant to be a means to ascend up and meet the gods in the heavenly realm. So it was a means to ascend up into heaven. So what's going on in Genesis chapter 11 is that wicked man, sinful man, is seeking to reverse the curse of the fall and to gain a blessing of an eternal city being constructed together and the people being gathered together by their own means. And notice this, to their glory, not to the glory of the Lord. Right? It's to make a name for ourselves, Genesis 11, verse 4, rather than to glorify the Lord himself. So I think the Genesis 11 narrative is an attempt to subvert the way that the Lord has chosen to redeem his people. So if Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 10 is the way that the Lord seeks to redeem his people, as we were talking about, then the way that the Lord works to redeem his people is humiliation to exaltation. But what the people at Babel tried to do is not to be humiliated and humble before the Lord, but to skip to the exaltation phase and to gain a name for themselves and then earn their way up into heaven by constructing the Tower of Babel. And so what Moses is doing in Deuteronomy 30, verse 12, is saying that is not the manner in which you approach the Lord. The religious life of the people of God is to be the inverse of that. It's not the case that we ascend up into heaven to receive the blessings of the Lord, but instead the opposite must be the case, where the Lord must himself come down. And this is something that the people should have been very familiar with in terms of their own life as the people of God. Right? This is a covenant revealed to the people of God from where? Mount Sinai. Where the Lord came down in that theophanic presence of fire and cloud and thunder, and revealed this very covenant to the people of God. So in their own life, as the history of the people of God, they should see how the Lord comes to work out redemption for them, rather than them working their way up into the presence of God.